This is Ifayomi Grant here. I just want to take 5 or 6 minutes or so to talk to you about race, racism and football. What's prompted this quick YouTube upload is the fuss and kerfuffle about the recent John Terry, well not so recent actually, John Terry, Anton Ferdinand and Luis Suarez Patrice Evra cases. These are two cases where two black or African footballers have been racially abused by two non-African footballers. John Terry is a Caucasian. Luis Suarez has some mixed origin, although seems to consider himself to be accepted as Caucasian by most people. Now, one of the things I wanted to do was squash this idea, which has been heavily promoted, that racism is about name calling, and that if you name call somebody, whoever you are, then you're potentially or maybe a racist, and if you don't name call somebody, then you're not a racist. Now, it's really, really important for us to understand what's going on here, because there's been a deliberate attempt to promote this confusion amongst Africans to reduce racism to name calling. And why this is important, because it hides the much more widespread, much more pernicious and much more dangerous institutional and structural racism at play. So to give you an example, if we look at football, we see that of the footballers playing the Premier League, perhaps 30% of them are Africans, who are highly paid entertainers. And so this is presented as a sign that how inclusive and non-racist British football is, or certainly English football. But if you go beneath those levels and we then look at managers, we say, well, there isn't a single African manager in the Premier League. If we look at the senior coaching staff, we see that for those people going into elite level FA coaching courses, about 18% of them are Africans. But of people actually gaining senior level coaching jobs, only 5% of them are Africans. If we look at ownership of the clubs, there isn't a single African owner of a Premier League club. There's one, I think to my knowledge, Tony Fernandez at Queen's Park Rangers, one visibly non-white owner. So when we look at the actual structures of football, and you could look at also chief executives of the Premier League clubs and the other senior directors as well, chairman, we see that Africans are not represented in the positions of power. They're there as highly paid employees and people who can be recruited and dismissed at the whim of the Caucasians who control football. So racism is something in football that is both endemic and has always been endemic. When we look at the way in which African football is described in the media, we see the absence of racist name calling, but we see the absolute presence of stereotyping. So for example, look at reports of football and you'll notice that there's some words that won't be used or very rarely used for African football. The most prominent one is the S word, which is skill. You'll also find these other words, guile, subtlety, vision, all these kind of words which have connotations of intellectual ability or thinking skills or strategic skills will rarely be used to describe African footballers. The words to describe them will relate to physical characteristics. So you'll find words like fast, pacey, strong, intimidating, powerful, all words which relate to perhaps lack of emotional control. So exuberant, effervescent. Then you'll have words which connote laziness, like perhaps happy-go-lucky. So you find exactly the same stereotypes we see in the society about African people are endemic within football reporting, and in fact all other sports as well. Now, one of the things that these stereotypes do is they restrict the opportunities that African footballers have in terms of which positions on pitch are made easily available to them. While some breakthroughs have been made, you generally find the spine of the team is where the most important footballers play, and that's been a long, hard battle for African footballers to move from the peripheries, i.e. fullbacks and wingers, into the spine, centre-back, centre midfield and striker. Now they've made quite significant headway, but you'll also find that when a team plays badly, and again you can observe for yourself to see if I'm correct, you'll find that African footballers in the team will nearly always be the scapegoat for a bad performance from the team. If there's criticism of the team, you'll always find the African players will be highly prominent in the list of culprits for a poor performance. So when we look at this idea of name calling, we see the same thing in schools, where schools now in England have, and also Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland, have a racial instance called, and these nearly all relate to name calling by one child towards another. So teacher is taken out of the picture, the way in which teachers relate to pupils, the use of things like exclusions, other disciplinary measures, they're not considered as part of the issue of race and racism. It all comes down to an issue of name calls. So if one African child calls another African child the N-word or some other derogatory term related to the concept of race, that will be put down as a racist incident, and the child's parent will be called in and told not to be racist. Now, anyone with half a brain that's slightly functioning would realize that's not racism. That's a product of internalized depression and self-hatred. How can one African call another one the N-word or some other term, or insulting them because they're from their parents from the Caribbean, the other child's from Africa? That's just a product of self-hatred and internalizing the racism they experience in the society. So these kind of simplistic approaches are deliberately designed to take Caucasians out of the picture, dehistoricize racism, which we need to clarify again is a belief system, an ideology created by people, a group of people who classify themselves as white. There are really no white people, but they classify themselves as white, and they created the social construct we call racism to allow them to mistreat and abuse and oppress people who they classify as non-white. And they then break the non-white group into various factions, and they've used pigmentation as an easy way in which to differentiate these non-white groups. So Africans, Asians, etc. will all fall into the non-white group. And so what we'll find is, whilst on the surface, the use of outwardly abusive language has become more and more less tolerated and more of a taboo within the society, we find the social outcomes for individuals, particularly if we look at Africans, have really not changed at all. So to give you an example, the police have always had a highly conflicted relationship with Africans, and particularly African young men in England, similarly in the United States. Now, the police no longer or very rarely use outwardly abusive language. We're told that police and community relations have improved. But for example, when you look at the use of stop and search, we find in England, in this supposedly liberal bastion of post-racial society, we find that the use of stop and search under a section of the Criminal Justice Act called Section 60 is up to 30 times disproportionate in terms of its use towards Africans compared to Caucasians. So many police authorities, an African is 30 times more likely to be stopped and searched using Section 60 than a Caucasian is. Now the interesting thing about Section 60, it allows police officers to stop people without any reasonable suspicion. And it was actually brought onto the statute books to stop what they call raves, these dances that used to happen, what they call illegal dances in warehouses with rave music and lots of ecstasy and other drugs, and it was actually used to stop people congregating and going to raves. But now the police, as usual, have misused this increase in their powers to target Africans. Now most of these stops will involve no outward racism in terms of verbal abuse, if you equate racism and verbal abuse, but they will involve the systematic targeting of African people in an attempt to continually criminalize young African men. So we need to understand the substance and reality of things. You don't need to have racial abuse to have racism. The absence of racial abuse doesn't prove anything in terms of racism. Racism is a structured system of power created by people who consider themselves white to allow them to abuse people they consider to be non-white. And that's what we need to remember from race, racism and football, or in any other field of endeavour. We need to understand what racism is and how it operates. Hotep.